DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Odunze will be the focal point of the Chicago Bears offense. But what does that leave for the tight ends, Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett, when your top three receivers are all racing for 1,000 yards?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Terms apply. On the show today, we look at what kind of tight end production could still be there in this Bears offense, with so much of the attention rightfully going to the wide receiver core that's been bolstered, boosted, and is one of the strongest in the NFL. You've got a pretty good tight end group here as well, but Shane Waldron's offense hasn't necessarily produced big numbers for the tight ends, at least not in Seattle, but those weren't Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett at tight end in Seattle either, but these wide receivers are going to take a lot of the catches and a lot of the targets and a lot of the yards. So where does that then leave these Bears tight ends? I think it's going to be a drop in production. It's just a matter of how much, particularly for Kmet, but Gerald Everett could be in for a big drop-off as well as we kind of compare what the Bears have to what Waldron has been able to do with the Seattle Seahawks tight ends, which isn't a one-to-one comparison, but it's the closest starting point we have to look. I think in particular, Noah Fant is the good case study here because he was traded to the Seahawks as part of the Russell Wilson deal from Denver. In Denver, he was more productive. He had a stronger start to his career. He was a relatively early draft pick. Not exactly the same as Cole Kmet, but a first-round pick for them, having 600 yards a year, close to 700 for a couple of seasons in Denver, gets traded to Seattle, and the production certainly drops off in Shane Waldron's offense here because he goes to a Seahawks team that had DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, and then last year added a rookie first-round wide receiver in Jackson Smith-Njigba, and the production drops off even more. And I'm not convinced that somehow Noah Fant got worse going from age 24 to 25 and now 26. But you can clearly see when he goes to Seattle, there's a drop-off in production. And then when Jackson Smith-Njigba joins, there's another drop-off in production. In his last year in Denver, 2021, he had 68 catches for 670 yards and 4 touchdowns. Those are similar types of numbers to what Cole Kmet has put up in this Bears offense. He's a little higher than that past season, but roughly in the same range, right? Almost 70 catches, almost 700 yards. Pretty good season for a tight end in Denver. Gets traded to Seattle into Shane Waldron's offense in 2022, then with just the two big wide receivers, Lockett and Metcalf, but no JSN yet for them. He drops down to 50 catches and 486 yards. Plays fewer snaps from season to season. I still had 4 touchdowns, but fewer snaps, fewer targets, fewer catches, fewer yards, because each of those wide receivers were 1,000-yard receivers in Waldron's offense. They're, it's not a slight to Noah Fant to say that Metcalf and Lockett are better weapons for their offense and should get the ball more than Noah Fant, but clearly there was a drop-off there. Then we go into 2023, this past season, they draft a rookie wide receiver early in the first round, Jackson Smith-Njigba, to be that third wheel behind 2,000-yard guys in Lockett and Metcalf, and Fant's playing time and production drops yet again as he moves to be kind of the fourth option in that offense. 43 targets, 32 catches, 414 yards, 0 touchdowns last season. Not a high-end number one tight end production right there because, again, he became the fourth option in this offense. But I think when you look at this Chicago Bears offense as a comparison, and again, not to say that Cole Kmet and Noah Fant are the same player or have exactly the same skill set or are going to produce at the exact same talent level. It's just, here's what the number one tight end did in the Seahawks offense with Shane Waldron, now Waldron in Chicago. What will the number one tight end do here? I mean, I have to feel like Cole Kmet's going to be the number 4 passing option on this offense as well. Obviously, DJ Moore and Keenan Allen are going to be 1 and 2 in some order. And then it's a question, is Cole Kmet 3 or is Rome Odunze 3? And I think we saw in Seattle that Jackson Smith-Njigba, the rookie, was 3 ahead of the tight end. Maybe Kmet can be bigger than that, but certainly having Moore and Allen and Odunze is going to cut into Cole Kmet's production in some way, shape, or form. This coming after his best season in the NFL this past year, where I think he had what I think was like 71 catches for 710 yards, maybe 73 catches for 719 yards and 6 touchdowns. Like, this was his most productive season in the league. 90 targets as well. Like, he was a really important part of this Bears offense. Those numbers have to come down. Like, you can't have an offense. The Bears are not going to produce enough passing for Kmet to have 700 yards and DJ Moore to have 1,000 yards and Keenan Allen to have, 900 yards or whatever, and Rome Odunze to have 600 or 700 yards. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't do all the math on there just now, but that's already almost 3,800 yards, give or take. Not a math major here. And that's not including then the yards that'll go to the running backs and the other tight ends and the other wide receivers. Like, Caleb Williams would need to throw for 4,500 yards in order for all of these guys to be able to produce at that number. But as we've talked about on previous podcasts, we should expect Caleb Williams to have a good season, but not 4,500 yards good season. Like last year in Seattle, Geno Smith threw for 36 and change, 3,624 with 20 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. Like, that feels like a pretty realistic number for Caleb Williams to strive for in his rookie season. And if you're trying to split up, say, 3,600 yards among those 3 receivers, plus these tight ends, plus these running backs, plus the other wide receivers, and if you take 1,000 out for DJ Moore and close to 1,000 out for Keenan Allen and some pretty good chunk for Rome Odunze, if they're going to be kind of your first 3 options in the offense, like, that puts Cole Kmet farther down. And I don't think another 700-yard season is realistic for Kmet. Like, they're going to ask him to block even more than he has in the past. That was one thing when I looked at Noah Fant's usage. His total snaps each season went down, but his blocking snaps played about the same. So that just means the thing that was going down were his pass routes run. But he was being asked to pass protect about the same total number, so actually a higher percentage as the volume goes down. So the total volume goes down, but the blocking snaps stay the same. He was being asked to block a higher percentage of the time that he was on the field and was being asked to run routes a lower percentage of the time that he was on the field. And that's also part of what reduced his receiving numbers there. Not only was he just not playing as much overall, but not running as many routes, being used as a blocker a little bit more because those receivers were so much more the focal point. And we should expect that, yes, DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, at the very least, are clearly better options for the Bears offense than Cole Kmet. And Rome Odunze should be sooner rather than later, maybe not week 1 as a rookie, trying to figure out his role in this offense, but he's going to be a big-time playmaker for this team and will likely be a better receiving threat than Cole Kmet for this team sooner rather than later. But the Bears also went out and spent some pretty good money on a number 2 tight end in Gerald Everett, who's been a productive receiver of his own throughout his NFL career. And I really think Kmet's going to have a little drop-off here, but Gerald Everett could have a pretty major drop-off in production because even the number 2 and number 3 tight ends in this Seahawks offense are even a noticeable step down from where Fant was. So we'll look at what this could mean for Everett and also Marcedes Lewis as the Bears' number 3 tight end, because we're going to see that all 3 tight ends get some decent playing time this season, just maybe not as much in the passing game. We'll look at how the rest of the tight end depth chart could do next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is here to provide online therapy to help you be your best self. So often we find ourselves comparing our lives to other people. Certainly social media plays a big role in that, but it's important to focus on what you want instead of what others have so you can start living your best life. I do online therapy every single week, and it's a really important part of my own personal mental health regimen, and that's why I cannot recommend BetterHelp enough, because it is such a valuable service to really help you feel your best and be your best. So if you've been thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try because it's entirely online, it's flexible, convenient, and suited right to your schedule. Most importantly, stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Cole Kmet may not have the same top 10 tight end production this past season based on this upcoming season, based on what we've seen from Shane Waldron's offenses in the past. But I think the more noticeable drop-off in production is actually going to come from the number 2 tight end, Gerald Everett, who's always been a pretty consistent producer throughout his career, but we haven't really seen this Shane Waldron offense, at least in Seattle, get the kind of production from the number 2 tight end that Everett has had throughout his career up to this point. It was a little bit better 2 years ago when, again, it was just the 2 big receivers in Seattle, Lockett and Metcalf. The tight ends as a whole were all able to get a little bit more production that season, but certainly when JSN was added to the mix this past year, we saw the rest of the tight ends in Seattle drop off that much further. Like if you really compare where Everett has been to where the Seahawks tight ends have been, like last year he was like more productive than all the Seahawks tight ends, and this year he's going to drop down a lot farther down, I think, in the from a fantasy football perspective or just from a statistical production perspective, that may end up hurting his value in the long run, but it's glad that he was able to lock in a contract, a big one from the Bears or at least a decent sized one from the Bears this offseason. So he's not going to, not going to try and enter free agency for a payday after his numbers likely go down. But the offense as a whole should be more successful as a result of him being here. So like you look back at this past season with the Los Angeles Chargers, Gerald Everett had 51 catches for 411 yards. That's more catches and almost an equal number of yards to what Noah Fant had this past season with the Seahawks. And in this case, like Everett was kind of the number 1 tight end option for the Chargers, but it was a little bit of a messy kind of offense. There's a reason why they changed out their coaching staff and offensive coordinator and stuff. And they had some decent tight end depth there as well. Donald Parham ended up kind of emerging as a bigger option for them, but their wide receiver core, once Keenan Allen was hurt, was a problem. And we all know kind of what was going on in Los Angeles last season. But Everett was a 400-yard tight end this past season with 50 catches. That was the number 1 Seahawks tight end last season. But now Everett's coming in and being number 2. So, like, if the number 1 tight end in this offense gets 400 yards, the number 2 tight end in this offense last year got 250. That was Colby Parkinson, 25 catches for 250 yards, essentially. I think Gerald Everett is a noticeably more talented tight end than Colby Parkinson, and in theory should have more than 25 catches for 250 yards. But I think that's kind of the starting point here, right? Like these Seahawks tight ends combined for less than 800 total receiving yards. Like they combined for almost what Cole Kmet had last season. That's the kind of drop off we're looking at here overall. And so if Kmet's going to come down from his 700-yard season, say he's down around 500, we give him like a boost up. Like Everett's going to go from 400 down to 300. I mean, at best, 300 yards and 30 catches. Like that would be almost a career low back to his rookie season. Perhaps the worst we've seen from Gerald Everett when he was still fresh in the league and a backup trying to find playing time here. And yet, like in some ways, it feels like an underutilization of the tight end talent that the Bears have here. When you have Cole Kmet capable of being a 700-yard tight end who can finish top 10 in tight end production in a season, and Gerald Everett can produce starting level tight end production, even if it's not high end. Like those are 2 starting caliber tight ends that are going to be reduced to a lower end starting tight end and then a middle of the road number 2 tight end. And it's only because the Bears have so much other talent at wide receiver, right? It's not necessarily like negligence by your offensive coordinator who's just, ignoring some kind of great weapons that he has, but he's got so many weapons and so many players to get the ball to that you just can't necessarily get it to all of them enough. That it's going to be hard to really squeeze everything out of Moore and Allen and Odunze and Kmet and Everett. And I think as a result, each one will get to be more efficient, right? Like more effective, but in a smaller sample size. So the volume won't be there. You're not going to see 90 targets for Cole Kmet or 70 targets to Gerald Everett like they got last season. I mean, Noah Fant had 43 in Seattle. Like it's not a volume of passing production. But what we did see is in Seattle, for example, with Fant, once you added the third receiver to the offense, and the size of Fant's role definitely went down. But you look from year to year, he had a jump up in yards per reception. It's the highest he had since his rookie season. He had almost 13 yards per catch in that game. He had a higher success rate on his passing plays, picking up first downs. Because you have so much of the emphasis and the focus and the volume going through your wide receivers, when the tight ends then do get their opportunity, they're going to be in better positions because all of the focus and all of the attention is on those wide receivers that are getting the primary coverage. And because the ball's going to them so much, the defense is focusing in on them. So then there's going to be a lot less attention, a lot less focus on these tight ends, so that when the play, when the progression or the play design does go to the tight end up the seam or whatever, the safeties are going to be looking at the wide receivers, the cornerbacks. Everyone's going to be focused on where's Keenan Allen, where's DJ Moore, maybe where's Odunze, and that's going to leave that much more space for Cole Kmet or Gerald Everett. It's going to leave lesser coverage matchups. They're not going to be able to say, okay, we're going to dedicate our strong safety to covering Cole Kmet because we need that matchup here to stop their tight end. It's no, we got to make sure our safeties are staying ahead of these wide receivers. So over the course of the season, Kmet and Gerald Everett are going to have fewer targets, fewer catches, and fewer total yards. But I would bet each catch is going to go a little bit farther. They're going to get a few more yards after the catch. They're going to force a few more missed tackles after the catch. Each opportunity that the ball is going to be in their hands are going to be more productive. They're just going to have fewer of them overall. So that when we look at the box score stat sheet at the end of the season, we're going to say, man, Cole Kmet had a down year, or Gerald Everett had a down year, or these guys were not nearly as productive this season. They must not have played well. And that's where that's the stop right there before we get to that last sentence. Yes, their numbers are going to be down, but it doesn't have to be a reflection of them not playing well. And I think their role in this offense will still be critical, right? We should not measure the success of Kmet and Everett and Marcedes Lewis purely by targets, catches, yards, touchdowns. Those will be an important part of the offense. And when they're called upon for those plays, they're going to need to produce them. But we also know that Shane Waldron is going to use a lot of 2 and 3 tight end sets. And often that's going to involve them doing maybe even more blocking than what they did in the past. Not Marcedes Lewis, because he mostly just blocks, but the other 2 guys are going to be asked to block a little bit more. And those are going to be critical both in pass protection and in the running game to springing big plays downfield, that they're not going to be the guy who gets the catch or the yards on those plays, but they're going to do their job on those plays that allows the offense as a whole to generate the yards and the catch and the touchdowns that just won't be directly attributed to them making the play, but they will have an important role on the plays that then become those big plays, even if those plays aren't made by them. And it is, in fact, their threat as a blocker and as a receiver that can open up so much more for this offense. When you think about the amount of play action that Waldron is going to want to use in motion for these tight ends to make the linebackers have to respect that every time Cole Kmet is on the field or every time Gerald Everett's on the field, I have to be ready for him to block. And I have to be able to stop, he's going to come get me in the running game, or he's going to be an extra player in pass protection. And then when he can start out as a blocker and then slip out on play action as a receiver, they can get used to him. Okay, he's blocking, he's doing a lot of blocking. These tight ends do a lot of blocking. And maybe they're not as keenly aware or focused on him running out as a receiver on a play where it looks like he's going to block again because he's blocked the last 5 times they've done this or whatever. Then he can slip out. He has that much more separation, and that's how those plays individually can become bigger plays, even if there's going to be fewer of them total. I am curious, though, about that number 3 tight end in particular, where Marcedes Lewis did very little as a receiver in the Bears offense last season, but Waldron's number 3 tight ends tend to do a little bit more. So I want to look at what Marcedes Lewis might be able to do in a potentially bigger role this offseason, or if Gerald Everett will just end up kind of absorbing the number 2 and number 3 tight end receiving production, and we'll just see Marcedes Lewis maybe continue as a blocker. But the oldest player on the Bears could have a little bit of resurgence in his age 40 season that we'll take a look at next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I used Gametime to go to Wrigley Field last night to see Steve Miller Band, Journey, and Def Leppard. And my ticket buying experience with Gametime was super easy because I can see my view from my seat before I bought the ticket. So I knew exactly from Wrigley Field, where the stage was going to be and how far away I was going to be from the stage with my seat. So I had some peace of mind of knowing that I was going to get a good view. And they have all-in pricing so that I knew exactly how much I was going to pay when I picked my tickets, and there weren't any of those added fees at the end of the checkout process that make them cost way more than you thought, and then you go back, okay, maybe let's pick different tickets, and it just becomes a whole mess. So that's what I love about Gametime for sports, concerts, comedy shows, theater, you name it. They've got all the live events in your area covered. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Normally, we wouldn't spend a lot of time talking about a number 3 tight end in any offense, but this is Marcedes Lewis, which is a cool, fun story that I think we all like and want to root for Marcedes Lewis. He seems like a great guy, great player, and the oldest player in the NFL. It's awesome. But also, this Shane Waldron offense utilizes 3 tight ends more so than a lot of other offenses. To be clear, this is not a tight end first offense. Like, this is a 3 wide receiver offense. I think people sometimes hear, oh, Waldron uses a lot of multiple tight ends, and you start to think that that's like their most common personnel package. This is like 60 to 70% of the time, it's going to be 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 running back. Like, the vast majority of the offense is going to be that, but they use more 2 and 3 tight end sets than other offenses in the rest of their snaps. Like, you'll see other teams varied up a little bit more with like multiple running backs and different combinations, or like sometimes, 1 wide receiver, 2 tight ends, 2 running backs, but like Waldron uses more 3 tight end sets than a lot of other offenses and a decent amount of 2 tight end sets as well, but it's still primarily a 3 wide receiver offense. I know it's kind of confusing, but if you saw the numbers across the board, you would kind of get a better sense of like, oh, okay, I see how it maths out. But just know, like, mostly 3 wide receivers the majority of the time, but then mixes in more heavy tight end sets than a lot of other people and doesn't do a lot of the in-between stuff. It's kind of the best way to think about it. And so that means we're going to see more Marcedes Lewis this season than we did last season, assuming the 40-year-old tight end can stay healthy and continue his incredible, really like Iron Man kind of streak. I know he's a number 3 tight end, so it's not like a Cal Ripken kind of thing, but still, the fact that he's still playing at a pretty high level at this stage of his career is pretty incredible for a physical tight end at that position. Played all 17 games last season, primarily as a blocker. But in Waldron's offense, like, even the number 3 tight ends are still going to get involved in the passing game. And we were talking about a little bit before, like Will Dissly, their number 3 tight end last season, had 17 catches for 172 yards. That's not a huge number, but if you compare that to Marcedes Lewis last season, he had 4 catches for 29 yards. Like, Dissly gets a catch a game. Marcedes Lewis got like a catch a month. You know what I mean? Like, once every 4 games, that's when Lewis was getting involved in the passing game. It was only in very rare occasions as a check down option, late in the progression. But like, comparatively, in terms of total snaps, last year, Will Dissly, the number 3 tight end in Seattle, played 378 snaps. And Marcedes Lewis played 330. So it's not as though he's going to be on the field a ton more. But I think in terms of where the passing game ends up going, Marcedes Lewis is going to run more pass routes than what we were used to seeing him do in Chicago. Like, he was obviously primarily a blocker. He ran 42 routes last season, but Will Dissly ran 149. So we're talking like 3 times as many routes run by the Seahawks number 3 tight end as what Marcedes Lewis did last year. And this is where I pause for a second to wonder if they will ask Marcedes Lewis to do the same things they asked Will Dissly to do as a receiver, or if in Chicago, Waldron will change things up a little bit more and not just, like we use the Seahawks as a comparison here because personnel-wise, it's similar in having two great receivers plus a promising rookie receiver and then good tight end depth. And that's what the Bears have also. Very different receivers, very different tight ends, but the same weight of talent at the wide receiver and tight end positions. And so we look at, okay, the three wide receivers in Seattle can compare talent-wise to the three wide receivers in Chicago. So then what does that leave for the three tight ends in Chicago compared to the three tight ends in Seattle? And this is where I think there's the most difference, right? I think Gerald Everett is a lot more different than Colby Parkinson, and Marcedes Lewis is a lot more different than Will Dissly. Not to say that Kmet and Fant are equal and the same at all, but as far as the biggest differences here. And so I wonder if, for Waldron, we'll see Gerald Everett kind of get the combined number 2 and number 3 tight end production. That if you take what the Seahawks number 2 and number 3 did as kind of like those, 4th and 5th type options on a passing play, if those will kind of all funnel towards Gerald Everett, like, are we going to ask Marcedes Lewis to run 150 routes this season after running less than 50 last year? Is that the best use of Marcedes Lewis's talent? I mean, maybe he caught some passes and still ran hard. He ran slow, but he still ran hard. He still has value as a receiver, I think. I think he can do more than 5 targets, 4 catches, 29 yards. I don't know that we should ask him to do, 25 targets, 20 catches, 200 yards. That does feel like maybe a little bit too much for Marcedes Lewis, especially when that those targets would probably be a lot more valuable going to Gerald Everett or Cole Kmet at tight end. Like Marcedes Lewis in the last 2 seasons has 10 catches over the last 2 seasons with the Bears and the Packers. Like he had 3 years ago, he had 23 catches for 214 yards, but like he has just not been a go-to receiving option. And I would rather those balls go to Gerald Everett. So if we try and translate the Seahawks tight end production from Fant, Parkinson, and Dissly to Kmet, Everett, and Lewis, I would condense those 3 Seahawks tight end numbers and then divide those between Kmet and Everett in probably a 60-40 type of split there. That's kind of where I would do the math, and then just a little bit of sprinkling left for Marcedes Lewis. So, I mean, I think that could easily be, 50-ish catches for 500 or 600 yards to Cole Kmet, and I think that could be 30-ish catches for 300 to 400 yards to Gerald Everett, and then another handful to Marcedes Lewis. Like, that's what feels appropriate there for those guys, which is a drop-off for Cole Kmet and a drop-off for Gerald Everett, not because they're all of a sudden worse players this season, or not because Shane Waldron is ignoring them or mismanaging or underutilizing players that should be getting the ball more, but because there's only so many balls to go around. And I think those individual plays that they do make will end up having a higher impact individually. There just will be fewer of them total. But I still think there's a possibility here where Marcedes Lewis gets a little bit more. He's certainly going to have more. I can promise you he'll have more than 4 catches for more than 29 yards this season. I don't know that that'll be 200 yards, but I think it'll be more than 29. I think he'll make a few more plays, and it'll be cool to see a literal 40-year-old tight end, big dog, running around and making plays in this offense. And certainly he's going to be an important blocker. And Gerald Everett is not nearly as good of a blocker. So how Waldron kind of balances, okay, like Everett's much more of a slot receiver type of oversized tight end who's not terrible as a blocker, but not very good. I mean, if we're going to be honest about it. So does that change how these tight ends get utilized? Does he switch up a bit more in Chicago than what we saw in Seattle? Like, those are the questions that we still don't have answered, but we'll start to get a better idea of at training camp and throughout the preseason in this process. And you can be sure we'll have all your biggest training camp updates for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day, and that means all of your team. We're talking Locked On Bulls, Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox, Locked On Blackhawks, Locked On Fighting Illini, and of course, any other city and any other sport you love, we've got a podcast for you here on the Locked On Podcast Network. So go check out one of those other shows for your second listen today. Come on back tomorrow. Make us your first listen once again as the Bears rookies report to training camp. We get any kind of Caleb Williams or Rome Odunze contract update. You can be sure we'll have that for you. Still think it's too early to panic on that front by any means. I think the Bears will get it done. I think any kind of fretting we do about that now is still a waste of our time until it becomes an actual problem. Let's not make it a problem, and it's not a problem yet. So we're going to be patient with that throughout this process, but we'll be on top of it with any and all updates, and we'll always be on top of giving you another opportunity to bear down.